In the final years of World War II, deep inside the frozen plains of Manchuria, Japan built a military research facility that changed the meaning of the word science. It looked like any other compound with rows of barracks, storage sheds, and laboratories. But inside, doctors in uniform were using human beings to test how far the body could be pushed before it failed. The people running it claimed they were preventing disease and protecting soldiers. It was what they called research, a scientific effort to keep Japan's armies alive for longer. But their work had nothing to do with healing. Inside those walls, people became test subjects in studies so extreme that even the scientists who carried them out stopped keeping records. Some subjects were left outside in the freezing cold until their limbs turned to ice. Others were dissected while their hearts were still beating. Today, we'll dive into how a program built under the banner of medical research became one of the darkest forms of organized torture in modern history. The facility was officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. But the name that history remembers is Unit 731. It was built under the direction of General Shirō Ishii, a doctor who believed that diseases could be turned into weapons as powerful as any bomb. Ishii was ambitious, persuasive, and ruthless. He convinced Japan's military leaders that biological warfare would give them a decisive edge, and they rewarded him with money, soldiers, and complete autonomy. He chose a site near Harbin in occupied Manchuria and built what was essentially a self-contained city. It had its own power plant, airfield, prison blocks, laboratories, and a crematorium that ran daily. Every detail was designed for secrecy. Trains arrived carrying prisoners, Chinese civilians, resistance fighters, Koreans, Mongolians, and occasionally captured Western soldiers, all blindfolded and listed only by numbers. The staff called them maruta, meaning logs. The euphemism made it easier to think of people as test material. Inside those walls, Ishii's researchers set out to study disease in what they called natural conditions. That meant infecting prisoners with plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid, then watching what happened. Every stage of decline was recorded as researchers tracked the subject's temperature, pulse, behavior, and organ responses until the subject died. Then the body was opened to document the effects on each organ. Autopsies were often performed while victims were still alive because Ishii insisted anesthesia would alter the results. Survivors from nearby garrisons later described hearing the screams echoing across the compound. Some of their experiments focused on how pathogens spread from mother to child. Pregnant women were deliberately infected to see whether diseases could cross the placenta. Once they became symptomatic, they were dissected so the infection could be traced through the fetus. Others were used for sexually transmitted disease studies. Prisoners were infected with syphilis or gonorrhea, and forced contact between captives allowed scientists to measure how quickly each infection advanced. The data was logged as if it were routine lab work. Ishii also wanted to understand how the human body reacted to extreme physical stress. In one set of blood transfusion experiments, animal blood was pumped into human veins to test compatibility. The results were predictably fatal, but the researchers noted each stage, fever, convulsion, organ failure, as if charting a medical case. Others were subjected to starvation and dehydration trials, left without food or water while their physical responses were measured in hours and days. The winters in Manchuria were severe, dropping to 40 below zero, which gave Ishii's team the perfect setting for their frostbite studies. Prisoners were marched outside, sleeves rolled up, and their arms were soaked in water until ice formed. The scientists waited until the limbs were frozen solid, then tested different methods of rewarming, like plunging them into boiling water, holding them near fire, or leaving them to thaw naturally. They recorded skin color, time to refreeze, and the point at which flesh began to rot. The official goal was to find better frostbite treatments for soldiers in northern China, but it became one of the unit's most lethal projects. As Japan's military campaigns reached new extremes, so did its scientific ambitions. High-altitude warfare became a new frontier, and Ishii's team wanted to understand how the human body would react to thin air and low pressure. Inside sealed pressure chambers, prisoners were exposed to gradually decreasing air levels to simulate flight conditions. The researchers watched for convulsions, loss of consciousness, and organ rupture as the pressure dropped. Gas warfare was treated the same way. Ishii's men released phosgene and other chemical agents into airtight rooms while prisoners were locked inside. They timed each stage, from coughing to paralysis to death, to test how long protective gear would keep soldiers alive on a contaminated battlefield. The most visibly violent work came from weapon injury experiments. Captives were tied to stakes in open fields, while grenades, flamethrowers, or bullets were used at varying distances. Military surgeons observed how different munitions tore flesh and bone, then practiced surgical repair techniques on the wounded before killing them for dissection. Similar procedures tested napalm-like incendiaries and fragmentation shells. These operations served as training for battlefield medicine, turning prisoners into disposable demonstrations. All of this generated endless paperwork, as charts, photographs, and daily reports documented the results in meticulous detail. The staff logged results with clinical precision, but never names. When a prisoner died, another took their number, keeping the data set consistent. The prisoner processing system itself became part of the experiment, a conveyor of bodies through which cruelty was disguised as procedure. By 1942, Ishii's research extended far beyond the facility. His scientists were designing weapons that could spread disease on a massive scale. They bred fleas carrying plague bacteria, packed them into ceramic bombs, and dropped them over Chinese villages to see how quickly infection would spread. They contaminated wells and rivers with cholera and typhoid cultures, poisoned crops with anthrax spores, and infected livestock to study how long the pathogens survived in soil and meat. After each attack, army medics moved through the aftermath to record what had happened. They counted the dead, traced how the disease had spread, and filed reports that read like legitimate medical studies, except the people they described had never agreed to be part of them. These field trials killed thousands of civilians. The Japanese command viewed them as tactical experiments that could be scaled up for continental warfare. Ishii presented the results to Tokyo as proof that biological weapons could cripple enemy cities without conventional bombing. Inside the compound, life carried on with unsettling normalcy as researchers attended meetings, published papers, and returned home to families living just beyond the fences. The children of officers played within view of the laboratories, and to those inside, this wasn't a place of horror. It was a prestigious scientific institution. Promotions and medals depended on results, so those who produced the most lethal data rose quickly through the ranks. Human experimentation became a route to recognition, and anyone who questioned the work risked being labeled as disloyal. By 1945, as Soviet forces advanced through Manchuria, Ishii prepared to erase the evidence. He instructed his staff to kill all remaining captives and to destroy every document. When Soviet troops entered Harbin that August, they found only ruins, scattered bones, and traces of laboratories built for purposes no one wanted to imagine. The world expected those responsible to face justice, just as the Nazi doctors had in Europe, but what followed was something entirely different and far more cynical. The Soviets began collecting evidence, uncovering bottles filled with preserved organs and containers still labeled with the symbols for anthrax and cholera. It was proof that this had been a functioning biological weapons laboratory, not a medical outpost as Japan had claimed. Word spread quickly through Allied intelligence networks, but what happened next would determine how much of this story the world would ever know. The Soviets wanted an international trial similar to Nuremberg, while the Americans, who had already begun preparing for a new conflict with the Soviet Union, had a different plan. They realized that the data gathered inside Unit 731, as horrifying as its origins were, could be invaluable for their own biological warfare research. Rather than treat Ishii and his colleagues as war criminals, U.S. intelligence officers quietly reached out to them. In exchange for immunity, Ishii offered his entire archive of research, which contained years of meticulously recorded experiments on disease transmission, frostbite survival, and wound recovery. The documents were detailed enough to reconstruct every experiment without ever admitting that human subjects had been involved. American officials justified the decision by claiming that if they didn't obtain the data, the Soviets would. And so, the evidence of one of the worst atrocities in Asia was not destroyed or exposed. It was purchased. The deal became part of a classified post-war operation that mirrored the recruitment of former Nazi scientists under Project Paperclip. Ishii and several of his senior researchers were never brought to trial. Some advised the U.S. military in secret, while others resumed civilian lives in Japan. The official line in Washington was that Unit 731 was a rumor exaggerated by enemy propaganda. The full truth only began surfacing in the 1980s, when Japanese journalists started investigating long classified documents. What they uncovered showed how widespread the system had been. Unit 731 wasn't an isolated outpost. It was the center of a network of related units scattered across Asia, each specializing in a different type of experiment. Unit 100 worked on animal pathogens, while Unit 1644 conducted human trials in Nanjing. Together, they formed a research empire that stretched from Manchuria to Southeast Asia, unified by the belief that biology could be weaponized to secure Japan's dominance. By the late 20th century, the story of Unit 731 had become impossible to ignore. Exhibits opened in China displaying what was left of the laboratories: rusted surgical tools, glass jars containing samples of organs, and the cremation pits behind the compound. In Japan, historians finally gained access to files confirming that Ishii had died peacefully in 1959, never having faced a courtroom. Many of his subordinates enjoyed similar fates. Some became leaders in Japan's post-war medical community. One even helped establish the country's national blood bank. Their expertise, built on human suffering, had been rebranded as progress. It's easy to think of Unit 731 as a distant atrocity from another age. But in actuality, it wasn't that long ago. Many of the people involved lived well into the modern era, teaching, publishing, and shaping medicine as the world moved on. The questions they left behind haven't faded with time. They remind us that science itself isn't moral or immoral. It's only as ethical as the people who use it. The doctors who ran this facility believed they were serving progress, but what they created was suffering disguised as discovery. And when the world decided their work was too valuable to destroy, it proved that even the victors of war aren't immune to moral failure.